I am Daniel Lucas, and welcome to Book 101. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years, and today I have my special guest. He is the author of several books, no other than Mr. Richard Ayre.
Hiya, Daniel.
I'm fabulous, mister, and can you please introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Richard Ayre, author of several books, everything from horror through to crime. And that's about it, really. There's nothing much more interesting about me.
Yes, Mr. Richard is my avid guest from the audio from to video. So, Mr. Richard, what inspired you to become an author?
I think I think when I discovered books and discovered reading, and I liked writing stories myself. I used to write little short stories when I was at school a long time ago, just to entertain myself, and that grew really into writing my first book, which was actually Point of Contact. Was the first thing I ever wrote, first full script, if you like, and it was awful as things are when you first write them, but it's developed into something quite good, I think. And I sort of dip in and out of writing nowadays, I'll be honest with you. I haven't written anything since, I haven't published anything since the book that came after this book that we're talking about today, A Life Eternal, which was a book called Shadow of the Knife. I'm hoping one day I can get my love for writing back again, and that's what I want to do.
Looking forward, Mr. Richard, for books to come. Yeah. So let's talk about your. Is this your latest or second to your latest book?
It's the second latest book. Yeah, this was published in 2020. Now I think I can't believe it's nearly it's almost 4 years since it was first published. Yeah, so this was the book that I had published before the last book, if you like.
Okay, so can you tell us the writing process of A Life Eternal?
It was very strange, A Life Eternal. It is one of the... It's strange, I was just on Twitter the other day, and there was somebody put a question on Twitter about... have you ever had a book that's written itself? And for me, A Life Eternal almost did. I had an idea for a story about... I'd been writing horror and things like that, and I wanted to write something a little bit different. I wanted to write something that was more to do with emotions and feelings and things like that. But at the same time, I still wanted a sort of a sci-fi speculative type aspect to it. And so I came up with an idea. I thought I'd come up with an idea, and I said to my wife, I've got a great idea. It's about an immortal, but he doesn't really live forever. He is getting older, but he just grows old very, very slowly. And so he's lived for centuries. He is getting old. He looks like he's in his 40s or early 50s, but he's actually been alive for like 500 years or something. And my wife, Kath, she then showed me How to Stop Time by Matt Haig, and that's basically the premise of that book. It had already been written. I'd never written. I still haven't read that book. And so that was done, and then I thought, well, I'll not bother with a story about an immortal, because that was the thing that sort of was, to me, quite unique. But the idea wouldn't leave me alone, and so I started thinking about it again and looking at it from a different sort of angle. And so I came up with a story of a man who becomes immortal for a sort of rather convoluted reason. And I also decided that I wouldn't set it over sort of centuries and 500-600 years. I was going to set it over quite a finite amount of time, and I decided to set it in the 20th century. And once those two little aspects had come together, I very quickly came up with the idea that this person would be a soldier in World War One, and something would happen in World War One that would make him suddenly become immortal. And that's what the story is about, really. Unlike other books about immortals, he for most of the book he doesn't know why he's different. He doesn't understand. He knows something happened to him, but he doesn't understand what it is, or if there is anybody else like him. And he's constantly looking for answers, and that's really what the book is. It's the story of this young man called Rob, who takes us through the 20th century. From World War One, and it goes right up to 2022.
What challenges have you faced writing A Life Eternal?
The challenges I faced were, I wanted it to, once that idea of having that shorter span of time, it's 100 and odd years, but for a book about an immortal, it's quite a short space of time. What the realization to me was, I wanted it to do that because I think if immortality was real, and if you were alive for centuries and centuries, I believe it would drive anybody mad. I think if that was your reality, you'd become inhuman, because there would be nothing. Everybody you ever loved was going to die, and you would know this, and there'd be no point. And I think life would become literally pointless. And that's the idea that I wanted to come up with with Rob, that he begins to despise ordinary humans because he's jealous that they've got this finite time on the planet and he isn't like them. So the idea, I suppose the difficulties I faced was to try and take something where most people, if you said, would you like to be immortal? Most people say, yeah, I'd love to be immortal. Never die, never worry about getting any sort of horrible diseases. But turn that on its head. And that's what I ended up wanting to do in this book, was to try and show that actually immortality would become it wouldn't be a good thing. It would be horrible. It would be horrible. And there are a couple of parts in the book where I've described Rob as being a man who is very alone because there's no one like him. So that, yeah, the difficulties, it wasn't so much the history. That was one of the difficulties. Because I teach history for a living, I didn't want this just to become a potted history of 20th century, the 20th century world. So what I try to do, and I think I've managed mostly, is drop in little events such as the Cuban Missile Crisis or whatever, things like that. But I've dropped that into Rob's world, and that was one of the difficulties, was not to put my historian head on and then just tell a story about everything that happened in the 20th century, because the story had to be about Rob. I was just going to say another thing that I'd never done with this book, and I've never done since, is it's written in first hand. It's written as if Rob is telling his story. And that brings its own difficulties. Every other book that I've written before, I've had little vignettes of, it could be something that happens to other people, but it's away from the main character. Obviously, if you're writing from that character's point of view, everything has to be seen through his eyes. And the difficulty is to make it not, try not to make it boring, talking about what he's had for his tea or things like that. So, yeah, there was a few difficulties, but I think it turned out all right.
Interesting, Mr. Richard. So how do you handle writer's block when you're writing A Life Eternal?
I didn't have any. Once I had those for this one, I didn't really. I rattled out the first script for this book in less than 3 months, and it was nigh on done. You know, it was just bar tidying up, and there was one or two little changes that we made. But yeah, this, as I said at the beginning, this book seemed to be a book that just once I started, I seemed to know exactly what was going to happen, and it almost just wrote itself with me just being there to put it, you know, as they used to say, pen to paper, but putting it down onto into a readable script. I'm suffering from writer's block now because I can't seem to get myself into the motivation to do any writing at the moment, and I have had it before. In the past, I've tackled writer's block by leaving the script and just writing short stories. I've found that in the past that's worked for me. I'll write short stories about entirely different things to whatever script I'm working on, and that seems to turn some little cogs somewhere that makes things work. And I should maybe think about doing that again. I'm just really busy at work at the moment, and I can't. I just haven't got the time, unfortunately, to put into the writing that I want to put into it. But hopefully one day soon that'll come back.
Yes.
But for this book, weirdly, it just rattled out. It just almost, there it was. It was a finished product.
What authors or books influence A Life Eternal?
I would say certainly for my horror stuff, the big influence was James Herbert, British horror writer James Herbert. And for The Shadow of the Knife, as a historical crime thriller, I suppose books by Bernard Cornwell, Stephen Saylor. But for this one, I really don't know. I don't think this one really had any influences of other writers. This feels to me like my book, like you know, I'm possibly if anybody reads the book, they might think, oh well, it's a bit like this author's or it's a bit like that author's. But I'm big enough to realize that a lot of my work has been influenced by the likes of James Herbert. I'm not saying I'm anywhere near as good as James Herbert was, but just that type of storytelling. But for A Life Eternal, I don't really think that was possibly. There's an author I really like called Derek Robinson, and he's written a lot of books about the war in the air, the sort of World War I and World War II. He's written other things as well, but there's a lot of books about that. And I suppose for some aspects, possibly when Rob is, when I'm describing Rob when he's at war, in World War I and in World War II, perhaps some of the sort of descriptive writing perhaps comes from Derek Robinson as a basis for what I was writing. But apart from that, I think this was just something that sort of came from me rather than other writers.
Very well said, Mr. Richard. But before we go on, I want to shout out our listeners in Finland. Thank you, Finland, for supporting this podcast, because in Uusimaa, I got 63% audience there. Pirkanmaa, North Karelia, North Savo, Southwest Finland, and North Ostrobothnia. Thank you, Finland, for supporting this podcast, because this podcast is created to empower writers, authors all over the world, like Mr. Richard Ayre. So, can you tell us the research process of A Life Eternal?
The research process for this one was not too bad, because I do teach about the 20th century. I teach about the Cold War, and I teach about America in the 20th century. So there was a lot of stuff I knew, which made it easier to sort of drop the odd things into the story. For example, there is a section of the book in the 1920s when Rob goes to America and he ends up working for a bootlegger in New York. So it's in the Prohibition period in New York. So those little things, and just adding things in with my imagination. There are some real figures who drop into the story, but they are all minor figures. Like the sort of crime boss who was in charge of the sort of docks of New York in the 1920s. He's mentioned in the book, but the bootlegger that Rob works for is a fictional character. Right, yeah. There's the research itself was quite easy, and apart from just a little bit of internet research, just to make sure that I was getting things right. Things like World War II, I wanted to make sure that the aspects of where Rob ends up in World War II could possibly be real. I'm not saying any one person follows the path that Rob follows, but just getting the dates and the periods of the places where the different battles were and things like that. That was the bit of research that took the longest, I suppose.
Is it A Life Eternal? Is your favorite book that you have written?
It is for me, yeah. It is my favorite book. Like anybody, like any writer, I think the more you write, the better you get. Your writing gets better. And don't get me wrong, I've read the book since, and there are sections where I think, oh, I could have done that better. I could have done that better. But I think you're always going to get that, and I think you just have to. That there comes a point where something is a finished product, and you just think that's it. But yeah, for me, for the story, for the way it turned out, and really for the first time, for getting away from sort of pulp fiction, quite graphic horror. I like it because it's a very different book. It's got a quieter inner tale to tell, and it's just one man's story, which is something I'd never done before, and I like that. I like the way it turned out immensely. So for me, other people might say other books are better and they like them better, and that's great. But for me personally, yes, A Life Eternal is my. If you're liking your books to your children, this is my favorite child.
So can you share a memorable moment when you're writing A Life Eternal?
God, blimey. I think it was that little light bulb moment when when the idea of having it just over 100 years, and the idea of, now I know why he becomes immortal. Now I know what happens to him. And once that happened, the entire story just went bang, there it is. I know exactly how this is going to end. I know roughly how I'm going to get there, and I'm going to tell the story of this guy's life, because now I know there is a specific reason why he becomes immortal. And once that specific reason was clear in my head, the rest of the book just went phew, and it just really, as I've said, it sort of flew out of me. So I think that was the turning point, and that was why this book, I think, stands out for me as writing it. It stands out because that one little aspect just opened up the entire book and opened up the entire story and brought Rob to life. And to me, all of my characters are real. Phil Sturgis from the Prophecy stories, I've been talking to you before about this, and he's very much me. There's a lot of Phil Sturgis. There's a lot of me in Phil Sturgis as a younger man. There's not much of me in Rob Deakin. So he's almost like someone I met, even though I was creating him. But I met him, and he became a real person, even though he's a fantasy figure, Yeah. My favorite.
Yes. Interesting novel, Mr. Richard. So what is your advice for aspiring writers out there?
Just think, unlike me, I think you've got to never give up. I think you have to keep trying. The hardest thing about writing nowadays is marketing. That is the thing that I don't know how to do. I have never known how to do it. Try and get a decent publisher who believes in you. I was lucky for A Life Eternal and for Shadow of the Knife to have a publisher that pushed the books. But they can only do so much. You know, small publishers can only do so much. There is a lot that you can do as an author. But yeah, there's nothing. Well, I'm not saying there's nothing, but one of the nicest feelings you can have if you're interested in writing is that day you get your book when it's published and you hold that book in your hand and it's gone from this nebulous idea in your head into a physical thing that you can hold, and it's got a cover and it's got your name on it. And even, you know, some of my books aren't the best written in the world. Life Eternal's all right, but just that thrill, it's an absolute thrill to hold a finished product in your hand. You know, it's a thrill to finish when you write the end. It might be the first script that you've done. It's nowhere near the end because you're going to have to go through it again and go again and again and again. But just to finish it, to get, I don't know, 90,000 words down, you just think, blimey, I didn't even know I had 90,000 words in my head, you know. To write them in a coherent manner is wonderful. So, but yeah, marketing. If you're good at marketing and you can write something half decent, you should be absolutely fine. If you haven't got time to market like me, you have to sort of rely on other people, and they can only do so much. So,
Yes.
yeah, but it's a wonderful feeling.
It's a wonderful
Finishing a
feeling,
book.
people.
Yeah.
It's priceless when you're holding your book.
It is. It is.
So, Mr. Richard, what are some things or topics that you want passionate about exploring in your writing?
I think history. I'm passionate about history. I do love history, but at the same time, like I said with this book, I didn't want to just make it into a history book. You know, I think some books do about immortals. You know, it's sort of like, well, one day I bumped into Mozart and I helped him create a piano concerto, and another day then I bumped into Einstein. You know, it's not real. The reality of this book was he's an ordinary guy just thrust into this extraordinary situation. I think a book, it's like art. It's you create something that becomes yours, and you hope other people like it. And really, that's what writing is.
That's true. So, how has your writing evolved over time?
I think it's just got better. I think I've just got better at structuring, better at grammatical, noticing grammatical errors, noticing things like that. I think that's one problem with specifically Minstrel's Bargain is I really do need to go back and just clear up the grammatical errors in it. When I can be bothered to do that, you know. But then there's another big part of us thinks that's what I wrote then, you know, I should maybe just leave it. But yeah, I think it's just the ability to express something. My biggest problem, I think, is I'm too verbose as a writer. I write too much, and what I'm constantly trying to do, and it certainly started to happen with The Life Eternal, and it's happened with Shadow of the Knife, is I'm trying to cut down what you're trying to put across into fewer words, and that's how I've developed. I just think I've developed into being able to put across things a little bit better than I did previously. But I think that's the same for everybody. You know, the more you do anything, hopefully the better you become. Unless you're a serial killer, then you don't want to get better at that or things like that, you know, which is what Shadow of the Knife is about. But yeah. So I've
So,
just got
Mister,
better.
how do you handle feedback or criticism of your work?
I tend to take criticism quite well. As a teacher, you're getting criticised all the time. There's always somebody coming into your lesson and looking at your lesson and saying, you could have done this, you could have done that. And I think there are times where I don't agree with it. There are times where I think it's unfair. Some criticisms, and there are times when I think it's unfair, and I think you haven't understood what I've tried to do. However, the one thing I have never done, and I never would, is to, have a go at somebody for criticising my work. It's entirely up to them. Nobody owes me anything. If they don't like the book, then they don't like it. I might find it annoying that they don't like it for reasons that I don't agree with, but I just keep quiet. The best criticism is the ones where somebody will write a review and say, I didn't like it because of X, Y, Z. And if you think, sometimes I might think, you know what, I can see what you mean by that. And the next time, I'll try and make it better. One of the best reviews I got for Minstrel's Bargain was off this reviewer. Put a lot of effort and time into it and said what they liked about it and what they didn't. And what they didn't like was the ending. And as I read this, I sort of thought, yeah, I get you. I understand what you're trying to say. And I think that improved my writing, because I think the endings to my books became better because this one person bothered themselves to write that. They gave it a 3-star review, but they said they would have given it more if the ending wasn't the way the ending was in Minstrel's Bargain. And I think it's true. You need, and ever since that, I've tried to leave every book with an ending that is satisfying for a reader. Now, Shadow of the Knife is left open-ended because I always planned, and I still do, to write at least one sequel to that book. And people have commented on how much they like the ending of A Life Eternal. It's the ending that works for this particular story, and I have to thank particularly Pete and Cy at Burning Chair, because the ending is not very different, but slightly different. And Pete suggested something, and then I wrote it, and it works much better. And I'm pleased we did that. And yeah, so criticism can be good. I've had other reviews where people are just horrible, and you just think, "Oh, just there we are. That's people." It's not much you can do.
Yes, you cannot please all the people.
No.
Thank you, Mr. Richard. But before we go on, I'm inviting you to please do listen to my other podcast, Food 101, our 4th season with Chef Alessandro, one of the best executive chef in one of the 5-star hotel in downtown Toronto. So please do listen to our latest episode. We talk about our Food 101 culinary courses, culinary course volume 2, fundamentals. And please do purchase our Food 101 culinary courses, Volume 1 Basics, Volume 2 Principles, and the Volume 3. So please do purchase and listen to Food 101. So, Mr. Richard, what are your or some of your goals or aspirations as a writer?
I think I want to get back into writing at some point. Certainly, I think, and I want to. I've got lots of stories that I've started. So I've got a lot of ideas. Ideas aren't the problem. It's finding the time and finding the will to try and write it all down. But I suppose the main aspiration would be, is to finish the sequel to Shadow of the Knife, which I've written a fair few chapters, about 8 or 9 chapters of that now, and I know where it's going to go. I just need to get into it and get it finished. And then B is just continue writing and not worry too much about whether the books are going to sell or whether they're not going to sell. Just write, because as I've said, that, and I've just reminded myself actually talking to you, that feeling of finishing a book, of getting that last thing done, and especially when you hold it in your hand, is a wonderful feeling. And I'm missing it a bit, and I would like to do that again. So just more books, I suppose, is there. That's the main thing.
Good luck for your goals, Mr.
Thank
Richard,
you.
and looking forward for another books this year, or another more books this year. So, Richard, can you please invite our listeners to support all your books?
Please do. There's as I've said, there's something for everyone. If you like a bit of crime fiction, there's Shadow of the Knife. That's got some decent reviews. If you like something a little bit more esoterical and about life, there's A Life Eternal. If you like a little bit of fast action, sci-fi, modern sort of urban sci-fi thriller, there's Point of Contact. And if a bit of gory, blood-soaked pulp horror floats your boat, there's the Prophecy trilogy of the Minstrel books. So there's something for everybody.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Richard Ayre, because if we support him, more books to come. So, Mr. Richard, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Daniel. Thanks very much.
More to come, people. See you soon.